Whenever it seems like my channel is on the precipice of death, clawing for life, sucking the marrow out of the rotten skeletons that make up my backlog, I can always reliably return to the same old punching bag. In the interest of full disclosure, this is very much a new take of the video I've made previous. Like Daredevil, it's born again under a new context and a new ideology. A reboot, bringing in new people and with any luck learning from mistakes that I made in the past. My last video on the Marvel Cinematic Universe is one that over the months has soured and changed. New announcements, rebuttals to my original video, and the fact that Phase 4 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is all done now, has forced me to take a step back and introspect on what I said and did in my last video, and provide what in my mind would pass as a story of redemption. But don't mistake my wording for my changing the overall tune of my song though, because Phase 4 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe still sucks. As said earlier, the 4th chapter of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is done now. No more Thor, no more Miss Marvel, no more werewolves and other creepy crawlies. The nightmare is over and we have a brief reprieve until February comes knocking with Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. So I figure what better time to look back on the original video I made with the hindsight of all this amazing new stuff. I'm not an idiot though. I'm fully aware most of you haven't watched the original video and I'm not going to completely tank my watch time by asking you all to take 26 minutes out of your day to click on an old video just for the sake of context. I'm not the MCU. This is a solo video of its own fresh perspective, but it's important to provide context where needed. Going into my original video, my thoughts were that post-Endgame the MCU had lost its purpose. It lost its villain, its star, and its overarching plot. No more gemstones, no more Avengers. Endgame in my mind, as well as the minds of others, felt like a golden opportunity to close the book on the MCU as we knew it. 3 out of the 6 original Avengers either went to hell to hang out with that one Russian guy or ended up an old man whose only future utility in the MCU will be what cool gadget he leaves behind in his will. There were characters to follow up on and keep adding more to in the aftermath, however. Spider-Man at that point only had one good movie and one kinda lame movie that left a lot to be desired. As annoying and tone-deaf as Spider-Man fans are, their endless whining about MCU Spider-Man wasn't entirely unwarranted and presented an opportunity for Marvel and Sony to build upon the foundations they set up. The Guardians left things off on a pretty low note and begged for someone to continue their story. Thor had gone through the absolute ringer and came out a pretty cool character for the most part and would have made a great addition to future projects, with an endless well of stories to tell given the state of his character when we last saw him. Black Panther also would have had plenty of opportunities for new stories to be told. There's a whole list that would be a nightmare to get through. Point is, the MCU could have ended after Endgame, but there was wiggle room to branch out, expand and tell new stories with the players they set up, as well as a practically infinite supply of plot lines and characters over the decades to pull from. But here we are, sat on the rubble of the once mighty MCU, the thing that had issues spanning all the way back to its inception but still seemed too big and too good to fail. My name is Ozymandias, look upon my works ye mighty and despair. All the quality stuff from its peak, Iron Man 1, Captain America, The Winter Soldier, Avengers Infinity War, etc, etc. Now here we are in 2023 with these monuments being replaced by a puddle of piss and a mound of corpses. To cut a long story short, the Marvel Cinematic Universe's 4th phase has been a mess of crappy movies and TV shows spammed out in quick succession, riddled with bland storytelling, shoddy visual effects, contradictory, muddled writing, and boring presentation. And I'm done with it. I'm sick of the MCU, I'm leaving it behind, and though I may one day pick up those blades again, I mostly want to leave it behind and jump ship to something else. It's over! You are done! I'm basically Kratos now. This is all well and good though, using basic adjectives like boring and bland to describe something and then calling it a day. But where's the meat? Where's the substance? Well, that's a can of worms that could span for an eternity if I opened it fully. Moon Knight is a very surface level character study that pushed aside most of its deeper themes for a more streamlined and safe TV show. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is a film with very impressive presentation but an abysmal plot that compromises its own logic and consistency for the sake of a cool action scene, cool cameo appearance, and a cool funny line.
Hit a guy, hit it there.
Ugh, excuse me, heavens. Oh.
And Thor Love and Thunder is just the worst thing ever. Except the goats though, those were funny. But boom! There, I gave a somewhat more streamlined explanation of some of my points. And many of what I've said about any of these 3 examples could be applied to the rest of the things making up Phase 4's lineup. In my original video, I boiled down my reasoning for why I thought the MCU was starting to get stale was because they adopted an attitude to throw diarrhea doo-doo at the wall and see what sticks. Black Widow prequel that takes place around Civil War? Whatever. A Hawkeye show? Why not? A movie about the Eternals, an ancient race of beings that shaped Earth and its history and civilization? Sure. Marvel's first 3 phases featured an overarching story in the Infinity Stones and a villain in Thanos, with the majority of those films somehow contributing to that vision, whether that be for introducing a world-building element that would later prove vital or a character that would later be involved in the fight against the big bad. Phase 4 preceded the culmination of that story. It was the endgame to the endgame. Characters died, the storyline was concluded, and the main thing on my mind when they wrapped it all up was what they could possibly follow it up with. And Phase 4 was kind of all over the place with that. It had a load of characters to juggle, end-of-the-world stakes every few weeks, and was constantly setting up plot threads that seemed to be building towards an unfocused and muddy endpoint. People were quick to point out in my last video, however, this was an attempt from Marvel to replicate what Phase 1 was going for, to be less focused on making movies to set up an overarching plot and more so divert attention to making sure we had new characters to follow. That the focus of this phase was to be standalone, and introduce its audience to wildly different characters and have them all come together in some big, expansive event later down the line, but for the moment would remain self-contained. At least, in theory. Full disclosure, I don't think Phase 4 has been very good at getting this idea across, and a lot of my original points I think still stand. I'll concede though that, yeah, Marvel Studios clearly want to set up new characters to fill the void left by others and pad out its already huge roster of colourful cartoon characters. Hence why Phase 4 has so far mostly consisted of solo ventures for new characters like Shang-Chi, Ms. Marvel, She-Hulk, the Eternals, and so on. However, you can't have your cake and eat it too. In theory, I would love the idea of the MCU taking a step back and allowing its characters to breathe in an interconnected universe that isn't so rigidly consistent, which is a big grand point worth circling back to, but for now I gotta play fair and reasonable. I and many others sing the praises of what came before, but even I can admit that the original 3 phases didn't have much in the way of varied characters, tones, and genres. The MCU is way too quippy. Every character is a 24/7 goof and gaff dispenser of a smattering of self-awareness and moral virtue. There are definitely differences though. Star-Lord, Doctor Strange, and Iron Man are all jokey, semi-sarcastic, and cocky, but that's about where their similarities in terms of personality end. Doctor Strange is really smug and pretentious, coupled with a need to always be in control and the smartest guy in the room. Iron Man shares a lot with Doctor Strange, but is a lot more loose and reckless, not viewing the world around him as mechanical as Doctor Strange, and is more driven by emotion and an affinity for theatricality. And Star-Lord is a kid trapped in a man's body who uses a jokey persona and a love of pop culture to mask and cope with a lot of trauma, guilt, and sadness. Despite these guys all being varied, however, they can still fall under the same basic bracket I laid out earlier. Even though they existed in the MCU at that point, you were never going to see a The Punisher or a The Daredevil interact with most of these mainstream guys, because they are also worlds apart in terms of morality and personality, characters whose moral compasses and actions are not so black and white. Phases 1 to 3 of the MCU perceive variety as something that should be strayed away from where possible. Not because of any malicious reason, but more because when creating a cinematic universe that would all come together, it's an easier pill for an audience to swallow when it's all under the same kind of umbrella. From a business standpoint, I really can't blame Marvel Studios taking this approach early in its life. It was a new concept and a risky venture that they had bet their whole company on, so the best strategy was to play it safe and make each entry either feel like a direct spin-off of the last, or satisfy the same demographics so they would be naturally interested in whatever came next. But it's 2023 now, and the genre has come leaps and bounds from where it was in 2008. Films and TV shows in that gap have proved you don't need big end-of-the-world stakes or a story that is so focus-tested and inoffensive to be successful. But we're still doing the same old shtick we were doing 15 fucking years ago. The tone of each project has remained mostly the same, the kind of stories we're getting is pretty much the same, and every character is goofing and gaffing their way through every act.
Hit a guy, hit it there.
It's annoying! I hate it, I'm done with it. I want to break from the typical Marvel formula and character archetypes, but every single time they wave the carrot in front of me, I get a gun in my mouth instead. They're throwing diarrhea doo-doo at the wall, but rarely did they dip into the colourful red and green fun stuff.
Ew, gross. I hate that visual. What in the hell are you talking about?
They're taking chances with boring borings that no one asked for, like the Eternals, but still resorting to the same safe and formulaic bag of tricks they've been using since Phase 1 without any of its positives. The difference as I see it between Phase 1's approach versus Phase 4's is that they built themselves up slowly across different projects with enough interconnected continuity for you to connect the dots, but also kept other projects at an arm's length so they didn't put all their eggs in one basket. And from there it was a slow escalation. Phase 2 built upon the foundations of what came before. It took its characters to new and interesting places, challenging their worldview and ensuring they wouldn't stay static, as well as expanding the universe that these movies take place in, as in the setting literally expanded as they went into space and other crazy dimensions, and in terms of world building, showing the universe's history, politics, and fleshing out the MCU beyond just being our world, but there's a big green guy and a girl who can do kung fu in it. Phase 3 was really when they settled into their gimmick. They pretty much shed the idea that the MCU was just the real world with superheroes that popped up in it every now and again, and mostly gave in to weird comic book weirdness. You got ancient wizards, mirror dimensions, wacky space stuff, and wasn't so standoffish about incorporating other characters. Phase 3 was really when you started to see other Marvel characters popping in to feature for a brief period to show how interconnected this franchise really was. When Phase 2 was coming out, I remember the big meme of all these movies was everyone wondering where the other Marvel characters were when Armageddon was raining from the sky. Everything was kept mostly self-contained to the players of its respective franchise. Iron Man films had the Iron Man crew, Thor had the Thor crew, and so on and so forth. Sure, you had tiny little nothings show up for a day in the green screen room every now and then, like non-green Mark Ruffalo in an end credit scene and most boring Avenger Anthony Mackie, but these were kept pretty few and far between. Phase 3 though just had fun with its sandbox. Doctor Strange showed up in Thor, Iron Man saved a boat in Spider-Man, and Captain America's last movie was the motion picture equivalent of Universal Studios' Marvel Superhero Island. You had all the Avengers, Spider-Man, Black Panther, and Harrison Ford all in one big ultimate showdown, all culminating in the event that put all soon to be closed Universal Studios attractions to shame.
Assemble.
This is all to say the MCU is not doing this. It's not really taking its time and doing things slow and steady. It's not leaving room for its characters or branching outside of the comfortable tricks they've been using for a decade that's slowly starting to drag them down. And I'm sick of that Phase 4 is the new Phase 1 defense. You can't have two things at once. You can't say you're committed to smaller, more intimate projects and giving this universe some breathing room when you're stuffing its lungs full of constant cameos and setting up for future things with almost every crappy 6-episode TV show or mediocre movie.
But at the end of the day, isn't that kind of superfluous? The two goals of lightly turning back the clock to start the game again with new players and continuing to up the scale and stakes of what came before are both kind of at odds, but it's not make or break.
And yeah, I sorta agree. When writing this video, I obviously went back to and reevaluated a lot of my initial criticisms with the current direction of the MCU. The Phase 4 is Phase 1 defense is obviously one I didn't really take that seriously and disagree with pretty strongly. But a note I got quite a lot from one of the responses to that initial video was that I was harping too much on the MCU not being diverse and varied tonally and stylistically. A good movie, TV show, Disney Plus special that does not make. It's the story, and previous films in this franchise, including this phase, have proved that these things aren't the inherent cause of thing being bad. Spider-Man No Way Home is obviously the best film in this phase, and when you really break it down, is it doing that much different from all the stuff I criticize in other movies and shows? It has a lot of really bad and annoying moments of forced humor, tonally and stylistically not that distinct from anything previous, and the whole film is built upon the premise of bringing old things back and giving fan service. I know that, it's true, so why is it that whenever I cover the MCU or even talk about it, my default is always to go back to that argument or that way of thinking, that the MCU would be better off if it was more experimental and fully branched out from its comfortable bag of tricks that have worked for years. And there are two reasons I think this is the case, but most relevant right now is probably just the sheer quantity over quality of the MCU right now. It's no secret that Marvel Studios having to pump out several projects each year has gradually taken its toll. For an example of that, look no further than the first Iron Man movie, with visual effects that put the standard of 2023 to shame. Then fast forward to later Marvel, where there's much less pre-production and practical filmmaking involved. I know some people like the look of these, but for me, they look really, really bad. And that was when Marvel had confined itself to only 3 movies a year, which is very much not the world we're living in now. It's crazy to think that this slate was announced in 2019 and we didn't get the first project until January of 2021, only for the final project to come out in November of 2022. In that short, just under 2-year time frame, we've gotten around 18 different projects, consisting of movies, TV shows, Disney Plus specials, and the rush production is clearly evident in spades with a lot of these, which I suppose if I dig down deep into my heart of hearts, I can't help but sympathize with. Sure, Marvel is a billion-dollar corporation, and chances are a good 70% of their cast and crew are cruel sociopaths that beat up homeless on the weekend and visit Epstein Island during the holiday. But vicious and unfounded accusations aside, a lot of Phase 4 was developed in the middle of a global pandemic and called for a major changing of plans. It obviously backed up their release schedule for a good year, left many unable to work on these movies and had to be developed amidst a flurry of new changes and regulations. But none of that really changes anything. Marvel was the epitome of too big to fail, and I doubt the overall box office of a lot of these movies would really be changed that much had they left them to cook a little more in the oven. The way Marvel Studios make stuff now leads to a lot of overlap, interference, and a need to switch things around and radically change something to suit the world Feige and whoever else is building. Black Widow's screenplay was written within 11 days with only a few rewrites before actually shooting. and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness probably had one of the most muddled productions of Phase 4. Originally set to be written and directed by the first Doctor Strange guy, but was then fired in January 2020 and replaced by Sam Raimi as director, as well as the Loki guy as screenwriter, who had to finish the script within 3 weeks, giving Raimi barely any time for pre-production before the movie had to be shot in May, leaving only like 2 to 3 months for Raimi to figure out what the hell he was actually doing with the movie before shooting. Then hallelujah, COVID happened, leaving Tom Hanks stuck in a hotel room and giving Raimi and Loki guy more time to write the screenplay and prepare for production. But even during filming, Multiverse of Madness was essentially written on the spot, with constant changes and reshoots having to be done to accommodate for all the wacky mix-ups and changes going on in the MCU. It was originally going to be set before No Way Home, but had to change that due to everything being reshuffled and so on and so forth. But to make one thing clear, I am in no way devaluing the work done by Sam Raimi. The guy is an incredible director and added in probably the most style and pizzazz ever seen in a Marvel movie. These transitions? Awesome. This editing? Neat. Weird Doctor Strange zombie thing? That's cool as fuck. But make no mistake, I hate this movie. This damn thing was meant to be a cool horror movie in the MCU, but the most horrifying thing we got in this movie was this. My issues with this film mainly stem from its incredibly messy and cheesy script. Sam Raimi is goofy, sure, but this movie very clearly isn't written as a Sam Raimi script. Take away the director and replace it with Peyton Reed, and what you're left with is an exceptionally poor Marvel movie with the only neat switch up being who they got to be the villain. The structure feels akin to a video game, getting cool item after cool item, made along with neat, clunky exposition. The world building elements it introduces kind of break apart and get worse the longer you dwell on them, and the dialogue, my god, the dialogue.
Hit a guy, hit it there. Shut the fuck up!
I hate this Marvel trend of switching from tones and emotions like it's a machine gun, firing so rapidly and quickly you don't even have time to register what it is you should be feeling before you realize your skull has been caved in. Doctor Strange be cracking wise and spitting pig Latin up his ass like he's Saul Goodman reading out bingo numbers, and will then switch on a dime to talking about the stakes of what's happening and how dire the situation is. What was at first a way to make a movie approachable to everyone is now pleasing no one. Early Marvel was quippy when it had to be and treated the serious moment seriously when the moment called for it. Nowadays though, it's complete whiplash. We're going from characters goofing and gaffing to them talking about dire circumstances and dramatic beats that are meant to elicit emotion from the audience. And sometimes it's the other way around, but equally as distracting.
I want to die a warrior's death, and then I can claim my place in Valhalla.
Oh, I hate to break it to you, but for a warrior to get into Valhalla, you have to die in the battle. You survived.
Oh, shit.
Maybe your arm is in Valhalla.
The God Butcher is coming. He seeks the extinction of the gods. Asgard is next.
Good God, is it really too much to ask that we have at least a few moments that aren't undermined by some lame Velma Dinkley Rick and Morty joke? Marvel uses its humor for a multitude of reasons. For one, movies are escapism, and when people go to see a fun superhero blockbuster, they don't want death, mayhem, and destruction to completely dominate their experience. You want action, drama, and moments that make you feel something, but you also want to have a good time, and a bit of levity goes a long way to accentuate that. 2. Superheroes are an inherently cartoony concept. You can play it completely straight, case in point the Batman, but taking characters that wouldn't be out of place on a kid's lunchbox and placing them in a world of death, terrorism, and misery isn't exactly the best thing to do with no humor or self-awareness whatsoever. The superhero genre in 2008 was one that was a mixed bag. You had some renowned films that took its source material with 100% seriousness, like The Dark Knight, and you had 3 movies that, while still having their serious moments, were filled to the brim with camp and fun. People aren't going to have as hard of a time swallowing that Captain America-shaped pill if you treat the concept with a bit of levity, because, well, it's silly. But the genre has skyrocketed since then and proved that there's more stories to tell and more ways to tell it than the way Marvel has been doing for years. And I'm not asking for doom, gloom, and every character being the Punisher or anything like that. All I'm saying is, can we have a movie with Thor where every single moment doesn't call for a joke mandate?
Floating hit alert.
Shut up! Where are we going to hold this year's orgy? Shut up!
The guy lost his mum, dad, brother, planet, and now his ex-girlfriend is dying of cancer and facing someone who very well might be able to kill him. And not once is there a moment where we spend time with Thor a little bit and get to know the man under the Chris Hemsworth like we did in Infinity War, where we saw the tragedy of the character and still had him be funny without completely devaluing his arc and drama of the story. Did I say I hated Doctor Strange before? I was wrong, I definitely hate this movie more. You had such good foundations to work with. Thor had a lot to rebuild, a lot to atone for, so much guilt and so much pain that we only scratched the surface of, paired with some of the best and most fleshed out characters in the Marvel Universe that understand that kind of torment. But nah, that can all be done away with in the first 20 minutes, and all that loss can just be shown through a cool tattoo instead of an actual interesting and revealing moment. Granted, Avengers Endgame did a lot of bad with the character and needed a bit of course correction, but why not just deal with the cards you've been given and you dealt yourself and just run with it, instead of defaulting to some boring ass status quo and awful humour for the sake of what's essentially one big joke you made with your friends. To be honest, that's how a lot of Phase 4 feels. I'm all for the cast and crew of these projects having fun with what they're making. When you can notice that something was made with a lot of joy behind the scenes, it's endearing. But this is an instance where you can have your cake and eat it too. Love and Thunder and She-Hulk don't really feel like it was made by people who are invested in making something beyond its surface level. Taika Waititi wanted to goof around with his friends and make a corny comedy movie with cancer and genocide as a major element of the story. Fun. And She-Hulk creator girl Jessica Gao wanted to make a superhero legal comedy, except the comedy isn't funny and is kind of obnoxious and the law thing is pretty non-existent. Does anyone really like She-Hulk? I feel like the only people who do have positive things to say about it only say that because they hate the people who don't like and are made fun of by this show. Which, okay, you do you, I hate those people too, I guess. But pointing at a beaten horse and pointing out how bludgeoned and dead it is isn't really funny. It's just kind of boring. And the show isn't really building to anything either. There's no story through line or big ending, instead there's a Rick and Morty Deadpool Velma thing instead. There is a cool through line in one way though. She-Hulk learns over the course of the series that it's okay to be green sometimes, and okay to be a superhero that fights demons part-time and a mediocre lawyer the rest of the times. Calling Typo to the stand, look She-Hulk writers, I get it. I hate these internet weirdos who sit in their pop vinyl cum dens talking about how much they hate new Marvel thing with snarky woman. Oh yes, it's true. Oh yes, yes, yes. But that's cool, green. You still made a bad show that doesn't have much in the way of redeeming qualities, and just because you're aware that your show leads to nothing that was mostly pointless doesn't mean you crack some kind of code. In fact, I'd argue it makes it a little bit worse. Making a gag about you not really caring about the craft of what you're making and pointing out your own shortcomings is at best a cheat code and at worst shows you're not great at what you're doing. And before you say it, Miss She-Hulk, yes, I love the Daredevil also. I love Charlie Cox. But just because you jingle car keys in front of my face with some generic Marvel cameo doesn't mean I'm gonna clap my hands and giggle. There's gotta be a little bit more to it than that, and at this point I'm sick of the constant cameos and references to other Marvel things to get people watching. And I admit, I'm part of the problem. Literally the only reason I sat through every episode of the show and got annoyed when She-Hulk was at a wedding is because I was waiting for Matthew Murdock to come on screen.
I'm here.
But is that not kind of a problem? Should these movies and TV shows really be hinging their story and marketing off of who we could see for a brief minute from some other project? When the MCU did this in its beginning, it was fun and interesting. We got to see different characters from different films interact, and it made the MCU feel that much more connected. And through its 3 phases, it built these up slowly and surely, making it feel more satisfying as it progressed. But nowadays, the cinematic universe gimmick is getting kind of stale. I'm not saying Marvel should do away with consistency between projects and disregard the concept of canon. What I am saying though is give these new characters and stories some space to breathe and exist in their own little pockets and carve out their own corners of this universe. Keep the street level, let magic be magic. The Guardians were pretty much completely detached from the rest of the MCU, and it allowed James Gunn to create his own little universe that is wholly distinct from the New York streets of a Spider-Man or a Dr. Stephen Strange. Why not do the same for Shang-Chi instead of rushing to get him involved with the Avengers? Why not let the smaller people you're adding stay small and isolated to their world before flinging them into the spotlight? My criticism on my last video of Marvel not having a plan was ridiculous, but I also think it was kind of misguided blame. Looking back in retrospect, I think the problem was more what I started this video off by saying. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can insist that you're scaling back and being more small scale and character driven when a lot of these projects hinge on what they're setting up for the future. Loki had to do Kang, WandaVision needed to have White Vision, Scarlet Witch casting evil spells in her cabin, Weird Scroll point up at space moment, and the Thunderbolts were set up across multiple projects. All of this setup made me kinda confused. I wasn't sure what I should be diverting my attention towards. Marvel was juggling all these different plot lines I should be following, and in the end I was confused as to what the overall point was. If this was to be the new Phase 1, they did a pretty bad job at it. Marvel's first phase was pretty standalone, and if you were to point to any overall goal, it was to set up the Avengers. Nothing more, nothing less. But Marvel is stretching itself too thin across multiple different projects, all for the sake of content, and almost every aspect of these movies is suffering as a result. I thought Iron Man and Infinity War and Age of Ultron looked bad, but you do not know bad CGI until you've seen the goofy shit they got cooking over at Marvel Studios. These poor VFX artists are overworked and underpaid and expect to make changes constantly even with tight deadlines. That ugly gold Spider-Man suit wasn't meant to be in No Way Home, it was a last-minute addition made to sell toys. So poor Bobby Blender had to painstakingly add in all this weirdness to dozens of scenes across hundreds of shots, all to make a suit nobody really likes. And then it's right on to the next project, with the end result being all these movies looking like cutscenes from a PS3 game, with PNGs of the actors crudely keyframed across the screen. This is a nightmare. This is an actual green screen nightmare and I hate it. And it's so baffling to me that it's gotten this bad. The idea of Marvel making its own TV shows for a streaming service was a pretty exciting prospect for me. They could afford to branch out and explore concepts and characters that would be too weird or small for their usual big action blockbusters. But it's like this studio was allergic to trying anything new. Why stuff these shows full of unnecessary CGI? Overworking the poor VFX team when that money could be diverted to making more episodes and fleshing out its concepts beyond the 6 to 9 episodes they're given. A big thing I get a lot is me constantly harping on Moon Knight, as out of all the other MCU shows on Disney Plus, that's a project that stands out as the good one, as it tries to adhere to all the stuff I want. It's on paper an introspective character study focused on this 1 or 2 or 3 characters trying to navigate their circumstances. And it's a story that could have been told well, and at times it really scratches that itch I've been craving for years now. But it's whatever I said at the beginning of this video, it's waving a carrot in front of my face and replacing it with a gun or something. You're gonna tease me of all these interesting concepts about DID, trauma, regret, and coming to terms with your mental health and then stuff it with all this annoying Marvel crap. It's the same stuff as before, the tone is all over the place. I'm being shown a character who sees himself as insane, waking up in a psych ward, and then at the end of the episode the serious implications are dashed out of my mind for the sake of a cliffhanger joke. I want the show to stay small stakes and intimate, but we have this big corny finale with a big kaiju fight between Egyptian gods and Moon Knight doing kung fu. And this is meant to be one of the street level characters. This is meant to be a story about some weirdo small player out in the world who's wrestling with his own demons and a manipulative god. But it brushes by all those interesting implications and story beats to rush over to some big action finale. Also, it adds some stuff to this universe that really messes with the MCU's world building and speaks to a wider issue that encompasses the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That being, Marvel can't decide or nail down a consistent cosmology on what means what in this universe. Early Marvel put a sci-fi twist on the concept of gods. Thor and Asgard were all just aliens in a system of planets that Odin looked over, hence why early Viking people called them gods when they were basically just super advanced aliens with superpowers. But in Moon Knight, the Egyptian pantheon are actual gods with actual agency over the world they watch over. And to add insult to injury, Thor Love and Thunder retconned the space alien thing I mentioned a while ago and spelled out that gods were real and the sci-fi twist is pretty much gone now. All these guys are actual gods and not space aliens. How all these pantheons can coexist, control the same planet and exist in the first place isn't really addressed. We just gotta take it at face value and forget all the other information and world building we had before. It might sound like nothing, but it's a small part of a much more complicated issue. While Marvel wants to have a big overarching universe that houses all these larger than life characters in one big toy box, it also wants to stuff that toy box with as many action figures and space gods as possible, and it's starting to buckle under its own weight. With so many new characters and concepts made to justify them, its rigid rules and tenets are hurtling towards inconsistency and jumping the shark. When talking about why I can't get over this whole tone and variety nonsense I've been going on about throughout this whole video, I listed 2 reasons for why I feel this way. The first one I spent a lot of this video explaining, and the second comes down to a little thing called world building. I'm not a I don't care about canon in the overall world kind of guy. I'm in the opposite camp of make the best story you possibly can, but if you're going to set it in a pre-existing world, you better make sure you stick to those foundations. A big point of praise you hear from a lot of long-time Marvel fans about this franchise's current direction is that they're becoming a lot more like the medium they're based off of. Comic books under big publishers like DC and Marvel tend to be a pretty messy and overwhelming can of worms. I've read my fair share, and in my experience, very rarely are they consistent. The strength that they have is that each writer brings with them a unique flavor to whatever they're crafting. You could have the same character, but depending on who's writing them, you could have a very different interpretation than the last. And with more chances being given to ambitious talent, the more interesting things you start to see introduced. As a result, you have a lot of variety in a dense world filled with so many interesting ideas bouncing off of one another. DC could have a grounded, gritty Batman dealing with street crime in one corner, and in the other you have the Sandman dealing with gods, monsters, and the nature of dreams and stories. It makes it more engaging and is a big part of why people are invested in the reality these stories take place in. But this can also be a weakness, as For me, someone who really likes world building and how individual components come to a whole, it can be frustrating to go into something that has a continuity akin to Liquid, which is constantly being reshuffled and retconned to suit the vision of whoever is doing what. Which is a problem the MCU is facing, which I put down to the desire from Marvel Studios to jump the shark and continually up the scale of each of these productions. With its previous 3 phases, Marvel built itself up from a grounded universe to one that included space, wizards, and reality-altering rocks. So I understand the instinct from Feige and all the writers under him to go bigger and grander, with big ugly halls filled with all the gods and big ugly fights between all the gods. But I think the solution is to actually live up to what you think you're doing and go backwards instead of hurtling forwards. The thing I always used to love as a kid was when characters both from radically different worlds would clash with one another and add a lot of interesting dynamics to any kind of crossover. I want the same for the MCU. I wanted Moon Knight to be a violent anti-hero that unsettles whichever bright and colourful character he's bouncing off of. I like Daredevil to be a guy with good morals in a world of grey that he's forced to come to grips with. It's annoying to lump myself in with this camp, but I like the friendly neighbourhood Spider-Man in a world that's ending every few weeks. And I'm glad they've taken that on board and are seemingly scaling back the character and going to his roots. The point is though, I think the MCU would be far more rich and better off if it took one of the best elements from its source medium. Let artists and actors bring to each of these characters a grand assortment of personality traits and differences, all within a much more bite-sized package depending on who said character is. That's why I have such a soft spot for the Netflix side of the MCU, even though most of it isn't exactly great. I feel like fleshing out all these different types of characters and keeping them all on their little proverbial islands until the big crossover would have been a far more preferable approach to this phase, instead of just thinking bigger is better with a great deal of fear of what could happen if they went against the grain. The MCU's peak has long since passed, and I truly think the best foot forward would be to take a couple of steps back. In the beginning, it was sink or swim for Marvel Studios. If they failed, it was over, but now they have the luxury to take a few chances in the name of variety. But looking at the rest of the slate, I don't have high hopes they'll do that. The new Ant-Man came out recently, and what a surprise, it's a repeat of the same problems that have haunted this franchise for years. And so much goodwill has been exhausted at this point that projects like Daredevil Born Again don't interest me beyond what I'd get out of it if I made a video on it. Up until now, my biggest reason for continuing to stick with the MCU was a sense of obligation. It may sound stupid, but this franchise has been a part of my life since I was 5 years old, and so many memories and experiences are tied to this franchise. I stuck with it because that was all there was. A Marvel movie was an event, it was a good time you could spend with your friends and you could get some amazing stories out of it. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is my favourite Marvel movie and even one of my favourite films ever. That movie is an emotional roller coaster, man, and when Volume 3 comes out, that will be it for my investment. I'll hang up the chairs and lock the door on my way out as I jump ship to James Gunn's next venture that looks to be providing pretty much everything I want from Marvel right now. Variety, interesting stories, an interconnected but standalone universe, and a respect for the script writing process. Lord only knows what the future might bring, but if it's anything bad, chances are I'm gonna be there to laugh at the rotten corpse.